This talk is about unit testing with Microsoft's MS Test v2 unit test framework. It was created specifically for our team, but has value for others as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we talk about unit testing specifically, we should analyze where unit testing falls in our test pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have our SQL unit tests. I generally use T-SQL-T for these, but we will save that talk for another time. On the next level, I have placed unit tests and integration tests. Normally, I would list them separately, but our software is dated and not unit testable by today's standards. So for the purposes of this talk only, I will be using unit test and integration test interchangeably. Next, I have REST API tests, which are often a good entry point to business logic. One step up are the JavaScript unit tests, though for our team, we can let the front-end groups handle those. Almost at the top sit our Selenium UI tests. And finally, don't forget a little manual testing. Why am I bringing up unit testing now? After working with our team's code for the past several months, I've noticed the previously written tests need plenty of work. First off, the tests are unreadable. The method names do not describe the test. Their variable names are cryptic, and it's unclear in the test which method is being tested. The test methods are far too long. Most of the cases fail to fit onto one screen, and some are hundreds of lines long. The tests fail to test for any specific issue. Many are simply wrapped in a try-catch and fail if any error is reached. And finally, the cases are not organized into a hierarchy of files or test classes. They are simply dumped into one large test file. First, let's discuss the organization within a test. For UI test, which I've written in the past, I have used the pattern shown here. I set up the required data, perform the test, verify the results, and finally, clean up any data I created. For unit testing, I prefer to follow the AAA pattern: arrange, act, and finally, assert. Arrange is where you create any object you may require for the test. Act is for calling the particular method under test. And finally, keep all of your asserts under the assert section. If you're not familiar with the MS Test test attributes, but are instead familiar with NUnits, I have included this handy table that illustrates which NUnit attributes correspond to the similar MS Test attributes. It's a good idea to keep this handy. Outside of the test case itself, I use MS Test test attributes to organize the test cleanup and class cleanup. What you are looking at is a test class snippet, or a skeleton. We'll talk more about snippets later, but mainly I want you to notice that my test method, here called test method 1, has a corresponding test initialize and test cleanup method. Also, the test class contains a class initialize and a class cleanup for all of its containing tests. In some of the unit tests I've seen, I saw many of our devs putting code in the test itself that should be moved to initialize function or a cleanup function. So here are the general rules I follow when considering what goes in each section. First, under class to initialize, I create the data that I use for all the tests in the class, as well as any settings the test may need in our database. Under test initialize, I create objects or I may reset variables used in each test. For each test cleanup, I may want to reset certain objects back to null or even reset a SQL connection, but that's up to you. Finally, under class cleanup, I remove all data and settings created for the class. This includes removing any record I added to the database and rolling back any settings.